Welcome everyone to this first AMEA Access to Finance learning event of the year. This session is organized by the AMEA Working Group on Access to Finance, and today we will discuss increasing the effectiveness of capacity building in relation to access to finance. We'll start with a few opening words from AMEA's Network Director, Mark Blackett, and then move on to two presentations. First, Hayden Aldridge from ISF Advisors will present on a few selected results regarding access to finance from a BDS, Business Development Services study done with 15 organizations, including AMEA members. Then Marise Blom from Scope Insight will present their access to finance predictive model. Those presentations will lead us to a discussion session with breakout groups where you can interact with other participants to discuss key questions for access to finance. We'll then conclude the meeting in the last 5 minutes of this session. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor to Mark, and I'll write some house rules in the chat. So thank you, Mark. The floor is yours.
Yeah, sure. Welcome to everybody. We've had a good sort of registration for this event, so hopefully we'll have more people coming in as well. And I think it is interesting for everybody, isn't it, in terms of how do we enable farmer organizations and agri-SMEs to access finance, because it remains a massive challenge. And the AMEA working group was set up to really examine that and really see how to accelerate the professionalism of farmer organization can then open doors to accessing finance, accessing markets, and that's what the working group has been looking at for the last two or 3 years now. And I think what we do is we try and turn learning into action as well. So the idea is that we don't just learn from these events. It also should spur some future innovation as well, and I think that's what you'll see in terms of the panelists today. We're going to learn something from what ISF has gathered from 15 case studies, but we're also going to hear about innovations, around a different way to approach things, which Marise will present, and that will be the interesting part afterwards, to sort of see whether what you take away from the learning and what you want to innovate around in the future, and how AMEA can support that innovation to take place. I mean, the incentive for us to innovate is clearly out there. I mean, you would look at a lot of projects out there are still underperforming, and people are not happy with the quality and the effectiveness of agri-BDS. Also, I feel from being part of the ISF process, because AMEA was part of the consortium on this ISF research, I feel it also gives you a window in terms of the quality of data that is out there to prove the effectiveness of agri-BDS, and the quality is not that good. We just have to admit it. It really isn't that good. We've got 15 good case studies, but there were over 30 organizations where the data was not good enough. And I think if we can, in the end, have an honest conversation around, well, why is that and how do we improve that, then we'll have more of a chance of being effective in the future. So that's what I'm hoping we will see. There's two ways you can engage, by the way, before I leave the floor to everybody else. You can do it through these global sort of working groups and webinars, but we've got roadmap processes in all the local networks that AMEA is supporting right now, and I'd encourage any of you who are in those countries to really engage with that process, and that will be about system change in those countries around agri-BDS. So I'll leave the floor to everybody else to stimulate conversation, and look forward to hearing your input and ideas.
Thank you for this, Mark. So first up, we'll have Hayden. Hayden, feel free to unmute and start your presentation. Let me know when you want me to switch slides.
Great, Felipe. Thank you. And thank you, Mark, for the introduction. Really looking forward to speaking about the research that we've conducted over the last six months or so. As a bit of background for everyone on the call, I will be presenting kind of the key messages and conclusions out of a piece of research that we've been working on over the last half year or so. This research is due to be published in a full report later this month. So you're kind of getting a sneak peek at some of the key headlines and messages. And just given time, I'll kind of quickly run through things as fast as possible here. So we'll stay high level, but looking forward to have a more in-depth conversation in our breakout groups. So if you can go to the next slide, Felipe. Just a brief kind of bit of background. So we can all acknowledge the importance and critical nature of business development services for agri-SMEs in emerging markets. And there is a ton of kind of existing research and analysis and literature that exists on the importance of BDS, the ways in which to make BDS more effective, delivery. What our research really builds upon this existing set of literature is we saw an opportunity to build a more sophisticated model to comparatively assess the effectiveness as well as the cost efficiency of BDS programs across different contexts and different situations. And we know it's an inherently kind of nuanced and context-specific set of services. So you can't just simply measure one thing against the other and think, yes, this is how the two are kind of apples to apples. But we saw an opportunity to kind of create a model where we could do that to the best way possible. And though that's kind of one of the key goals of this research that we conducted. And we were really focused on building on the existing kind of set of literature that exists out there. So if you can go to the next slide. So with that in mind, we came together with a really great steering committee and consortium of organizations, prominent organizations in the BDS space for agri-SMEs, including the SAFN Network, AGRA, Small Foundation, AMEA, of course, the Argidius Foundation, and AgriTerra. And we at ISF really relied upon this steering committee and consortium to guide us through this research. Just a little bit of background on ISF Advisors. We're a leading research and strategic advisory and financial advisory firm. And we have a lot of background and experience working in the agri-SME space. We have published numerous kind of pieces of research, including our latest state of the sector, looking at the state of financing for agri-SMEs globally. And so we really saw this work diving into the measurement and assessment of effectiveness and efficiency of BDS provision for agri-SMEs as a natural kind of next step in our research. And so we're really excited to take the lead on this, and also really excited to work with this amazing consortium of our steering committee who provided us some great resources and guidance on this. Next slide, Felipe. So the big picture kind of engagement objectives that we set out to accomplish was to identify and assess the efficiency. So what is the cost of BDS provision? And the effectiveness. Does the BDS lead to growth and resiliency or other kind of outcomes of BDS tools and methodologies? So importantly here, right, we wanted to kind of frame this in using kind of case studies of actual BDS providers and the data provided to us. And so just a quick kind of rundown of the methodology that we used, and we collaborated with the steering committee to kind of establish this. The first kind of key thing that we did, and this goes back to the kind of relative nature of assessment, was we really wanted to focus on the framing and segmentation of what we were looking at. So if we think about BDS provision, it's obviously very context dependent, and it's obviously differs from segment to segment. So we spent a lot of time thinking about existing kind of segmentation approaches, and both of the type of BDS provided, as well as kind of the target of the BDS. So end recipients and ways in which those are being provided. Finally, as Mark mentioned, we did this study on 15 case study providers. So 15 BDS providers were part of this study. I'll get into some more detail around that, but we spent a lot of time working with the steering committee and selecting out of a base of I believe over 50 providers who provided initial data to us, and we had conversations with them, and we narrowed that down to 15 providers ultimately. We then did kind of a process of qualitative and quantitative data collection, where we collected a ton of data on individual SMEs from all of these providers. We then built an Excel benchmarking tool that allowed us to measure on both effectiveness outcomes and efficiency outcomes, the different SME level data from the providers. And then finally, we conducted an in-depth kind of data analysis and interpretation, as well as qualitative feedback and interviews with all of those providers to kind of supplement the quantitative data. So, Felipe, next slide. So what did that look like in total? Well, as I said, we worked with 15 providers, and just to give a bit of a snapshot here, they provided us 509 agri-SMEs across those 15 providers. And these are kind of some of the headline numbers. You know, collectively, all of those SMEs had a revenue of $415 million. So I'm not going to get into all of these here, but it gives a little bit of a snapshot of the scale of the providers and the SMEs that they work with that we were provided as part of this data set. If you can go to the next slide, Felipe. So in terms of the headline results of the actual analysis, we looked at a few key kind of buckets of outcomes. So the very first bucket would be on cost outcomes. The second would be on revenue. The third is on kind of employment, and the fourth is on capital raised. So these are kind of headline numbers across the entire data set. So the median cost per agri-SME served across those 509 SMEs provided by the 15 case studies was $2,742 per SME. And then we looked at, you know, median revenue created, so $28,000 per SME. And then there are kind of what we're calling cost efficiency metrics. So that's revenue created per cost ratio, essentially. So for every dollar of cost provided to to an SME, there's $7 of revenue created. And these outcomes are we use the same kind of structure for capital raise and for employment outcomes as well. So these are some of the headline numbers here. So median FTEs created per SME, 3. The cost to create per FTE created was $617. And then finally, importantly for today's discussion, we also looked at capital raised as an outcome. The median capital raised per SME was $28,000. And the capital raised to cost ratio was 12 to 1. So for every dollar of costs spent on BDS provision, $12 of capital was raised per SME. Now, importantly, these headline numbers, while I think interesting and indicative of a lot of interesting outcomes here, we all know that the kind of context-driven nature of BDS provision means that these headline numbers kind of obscure some nuance and key contextual information that might not be captured by these headline numbers. So what we then did was we spent a lot of time using different segmentations and doing different cuts of the analysis to get at some kind of key takeaways that can be a little bit more informative for the market and get at some of their kind of sub goals and objectives of the project. For instance, understanding kind of best practices, more sophisticated segmentation techniques and approaches, and really trying to dig into this data to give a little bit more detail. So on the next slide, Felipe, thanks. We ended up with 5 kind of key conclusions that emerged as a result of this study. And I know this is 5 kind of detailed conclusions here, and I would emphasize when the final report is released in a few weeks, feel free to kind of read through this in more detail, because given the time. We won't dig into all of these in detail, and there's a lot of data and backup qualitative information as well that supports all of these. But to quickly run through, number one, we looked at cost efficiency drivers. And while there's obviously a number of factors that drive and affect the cost and the efficiency of BDS provision, two kind of cross-cutting drivers that we identified as having the largest impact, almost regardless of context, right, was the service delivery model that was used. So think group-based service delivery model versus individual-based service delivery model versus a blended model, as well as the starting size of the enterprise. And so importantly here, we found that the group-based service delivery model was most often driving cost efficiency and higher cost efficiency than an individual-based model. We found that in terms of enterprise fee coverage, so the ability of an enterprise that's being supported to actually pay for those services themselves, fee coverage typically is driven by both the enterprise stage as well as the SDM use. So there's a lot of interesting findings there where the more mature a company is, the more kind of often they are paying for enterprise or paying for services themselves. But I think really interesting here, the firms that did pay any level of fee experienced a higher impact across key metrics such as revenue, FTE growth, and overall revenue and FTEs created relative to those not paying. And that's kind of, there's a lot of interesting nuance there and opportunity, I think, for further research as well. In terms of a segmentation approach, I think a lot of interesting findings around, while BDS, as we all know, should be driven by enterprise-specific needs, the segmenting of recipients is crucial for determining kind of the most relevant type of BDS at an early stage of an engagement, or if you're designing an engagement at scale. And what we found was there's a really clear correlation of the type of enterprise being served. So think cooperatives and producers relative to kind of all other SMEs, and the maturity of enterprises. So early stage, growth stage, late stage, are the two kind of most commonly used segmentation approaches. So think cooperatives most often are kind of bucketed into one section, whereas other SMEs are bucketed into another. So that's kind of the most typically used across the data set segmentation approach. In terms of scale of providers, so this fourth finding here, there is really interestingly a pretty significant gap in the cost for delivering BDS, as well as the efficiency of delivering between global providers and local providers. So global providers, think those that have operations and headquarters kind of based globally in multiple countries, relative to local providers who are typically concentrated in either one country or one specific region. There's a lot of kind of background and context and reasons for that, why that might be the case, which we explore in depth in the report, but that's a really interesting finding that comes out between the differences between those two kind of scale of providers. And then finally, and this is, I think, really one of the most important points, and Mark hit on it in his introduction, but we work closely with these 15 providers, and we recognize a number of kind of recurring barriers and challenges throughout the process of data collection and analysis. And really, one of the chief things was the variation in both data kind of quality and depth and breadth between providers, and also the kind of methodology and approach to data collection and analysis from providers. And a lot of that was actually driven by varying kind of donor-led goals and outcomes that are being focused on. So donors are kind of driving a lot of the monitoring and evaluation of BDS provision, but they're very often kind of working in an ad hoc or isolated manner. So a lot of the kind of data outcomes that are being collected aren't actually consistent from project to project. And so it leads to kind of gaps and variations. And so I think this is a really important point where ultimately we ended up with 15, as Mark said, great case studies, but we had to work pretty hard to get the quality, to the data to the quality that we needed it to be. So just to end things, if you can flip to the next slide here, Felipe. So the result of this study, we also came out with kind of 6 key recommendations for 2 groups of key stakeholders. So the first would be kind of recommendations for funders, and the second would be recommendations for BDS providers. And while we kind of say these are 2 different target audiences, in reality, right, we recognize that everything is interconnected. And so I think it is important that both kind of target audiences are aware of all of these things. But to quickly just run through for the funders, what we really saw was there is an opportunity and a need for funders to, BDS works, right? We saw that companies and enterprises that were supported with BDS were able to grow and raise capital and kind of do all of these things at scale relative to the cost provided. But there's a need to kind of understand a little bit more the key drivers of cost efficiency and also scale of impact. Fee coverage is a really important kind of takeaway here. And so encouraging fee coverage and developing partnerships with providers that kind of pursue some level of this, we view as really important. This idea around local providers are very effective and efficient, and donors should prioritize identifying existing local providers that achieve that efficiency in markets that they work in, we think is crucial. And then finally, for the donors, this idea around consolidating and aligning on a set of measurable, actionable outcomes and data collection methods that can be applied to various contexts that can then allow for kind of a more in-depth and effective comparison of BDS across sectors and contexts and various situations. And that can then improve the data quality issue that we're talking about. This was, there are a couple then points for BDS providers. So with the support of funders, right, there's a clear kind of opportunity and need to collect and share data on the costs of BDS, as well as on the kind of annual performance of agri-enterprises before, during, and after the intervention. And this can enable us to kind of across the sector more continuously improve not just the measurement and kind of analysis and evaluation of this data, but ultimately that then leads to improving the cost efficiency of providing BDS, right? And learning lessons and understanding how to make things kind of more effective and impactful at the kind of most efficient cost possible. And then finally, a point, because we really saw, group-based SDMs and things like peer-to-peer approaches could drive cost reduction while still kind of maintaining similar levels of impact. So we think there is an opportunity to kind of further explore that as an approach, especially in situations where it might not be the typical approach. So I think larger or later stage companies that often opt for more individual-based SDMs, we actually see there's opportunities to use a kind of peer-to-peer or group-based SDM and drive similar impact. So as I said, I know that this is a brief kind of run through of a really kind of in-depth project that we've worked on here, and I'll encourage everyone to look out, and we'll share with the AMEA network and other kind of resources when the report is published in the coming weeks. But I'll pause here, and I know, Felipe, I'm not sure how much time we have, but maybe if there are a couple of questions or discussion points we can do. If not, we can also move on.
Thank you. Now we have 2, I think, clarification questions from Annie Porter from AMI in the chat. So I think we could use 1 or 2 minutes just to answer those. And the first question is on the study design. Was there a specific SME target on which the BDS providers aligned for the process? Was there a specific type of funder targeted to, or type of funding, assuming commercial funding rather than grants?
So in terms of that study design question, when I reference the segmentation and we go really in depth on both segmenting the providers as well as the kind of target SMEs that we worked with. And what we wanted to do was, within the 15 case studies, we wanted to make sure we had kind of a representative sample. So working in sub-Saharan Africa, we wanted to make sure kind of representative of a bit representative geography. So we had 8 providers from East Africa, 7 providers from West Africa, and we wanted to ensure kind of a representative sample between cooperatives and producer organizations relative to other SMEs. So we tried to kind of spread that sample to be representative. In terms of kind of the funder targeting, again, we wanted to work with a representative sample, but I will say, and we get into this in some of the limitations of the full report, but by the nature of kind of the steering committee that we worked with, who we connect with a lot of the providers via kind of those avenues, there is a little bit of a sampling bias, I would say, right, of those that work with some of those funders and organizations that are part of our steering committee. We ended up working with a lot of those, right? But we did try to mitigate for that as much as possible and try to get a representative sample. In terms of the question around fee coverage I see here in the chat, it's a really good question, right? And it's one that we tried to tease out as much as possible. In the kind of quantitative analysis, it's a bit difficult, but in a lot of the qualitative information and conversations we had, we tried to understand, is this a correlation? Is this causation? At the end of the day, it's a little bit difficult at this level of research to really tease that out. I think partly, yes, it's probably true. There is a bit of a selection bias on the SME level of those that are able to pay are more successful. But I do think there are, even within specific kind of provider level sample sizes, we did see kind of those that were paying some level of fee were able to kind of have a more incremental growth than those that were not, even when some providers indicated that, yes, maybe they were actually similarly successful coming in. So that's definitely an area where moving forward, using kind of the tools that we've developed and the methods we've developed, I think we can do a little bit more kind of detailed analysis and research potentially into causation, correlation around the fee coverage. But overall, the headline result was definitely convincing to understand, regardless of causation or correlation, there was a clear kind of outcome of those that paid achieved just higher growth metrics.
Thank you, Hayden. And quick last question before we move to Marie's presentation. There's a question from Ralph from the World Vegetable Center. How did you attribute the outcomes of the BDS in relation to all outcomes of the SME?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And it's another kind of, given the breadth of the research that we were embarking on and the real focus on trying to measure relative effectiveness and efficiency of BDS provision across different providers in different contexts, we didn't dive into the kind of incremental nature of BDS. And there are a lot of really interesting ways in which to think about kind of incremental to a normal growth state. What would be the kind of additionality of BDS relative to a non-BDS scenario? And the Argidius Foundation thinks about this a lot, and we initially actually tried to integrate this in and realized that given what we were trying to do, we actually felt it was more valuable to kind of not focus on that question and focus more on just fundamentally just the outcomes relative from provider to provider and context to context. But it is certainly a part of the discussion that we don't want to necessarily ignore, and it's really important. But I think at this level of research and kind of focusing on the assessment, comparative assessment, we found it to be more valuable to just focus on that area.
Thank you, Hayden. So I think we can then move now to Maurice. Maurice, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Felipe. Thank you, Hayden. I think this is very interesting, and there were a lot of things that connected, I think, to my story, and I don't know if I can still remember them all, but I'll try to. Let me first start with what the issue is that we're trying to solve, because there's a large missing middle or hidden middle, whatever you want to call them, and there's a mismatch between agribusinesses that need funding and the financial institutions or the lenders that are looking for finance-ready agribusinesses. So you can see that pyramid where there's a lot of agribusinesses at the bottom, can be cooperatives, farm organizations, and the organized farmers. That's what, when we say agribusinesses, that's what we mean. And then they're connected often to MFIs or SACCOs, while the commercial banks, the social lenders who have the larger sums of money to lend, do not have a large market to service. So this is exactly what we are trying to target. And we see that there's a very big learning curve at the lender side, right? So I think that, but that's not part of the topic today. Today, what we're trying to address is the capacity building side, which is then that green arrow on the left of that left-hand pyramid. So that graduation, how do we graduate them to become more bankable? And that has been one of the key goals of this working group, and now also this learning session. Next slide. So what hampers this? What is the reason why it is so difficult to unlock this market, to service these agribusinesses? And in a lot of research we've done also with CFI for Agra, what came out is that on the one hand, lenders find it really risky. And so they don't, the risk of these agribusiness, of course, agricultural sector is more risky than other sectors, but then beyond that, there is also these organizations that do not meet their requirements. So that is something that they struggle with. Then the other part is that it's very costly to gather data. Hayden already mentioned some of that. We hope that, and of course that's why we try to be there with our assessment tools to gather data in a standardized way. And I know that BDS is in certain contexts, etc. And there it's really important to take into consideration that context. Whereas we believe that by measuring where these organizations are, you can do that very well in a standardized way. Measuring turnover, measuring employment, that can be standardized. So that's where, by using standardized assessments and reusing that data to deliver that pipeline to lenders, that is the way how we can really lower the cost on the lender side. So that's reuse of data. But that's also not part of the discussion today, I think. And the lack of standards. And the lack of standards are the scope scores, the bankability metrics, the IWA 29. All those standards will help also bridge the gap and take away break the silos that demand side and supply side are really in. But let me now focus more on the riskiness and what can we do to lower that risk. And that is very much related to the BDS, the capacity building. And everyone who knows Scope of Sight and has been in these Access to Finance meetings before know these slides, so I'm not going to talk a lot about it. But to reduce risk, the graduation process, the capacity building, the BDS is crucial. But how do we do that, and how can the scope data inform the BDS to be more focused and therefore more effective? And so we hope that with our data, we can show that over time with Hayden's metrics on how to measure the cost effectiveness, the effectiveness and the cost efficiency, that we can prove that with using data and really doing in a needs-based way, that we can really deliver more bankable organizations. So that's the common definition of the finance readiness. Next slide, please, Felipe. Using our data, and I think our data set, Hayden, is exactly the 509 you also were working with, but it was a completely different data set. But that number, right, I recognize that one. Using our data set of organizations where we had sufficient information, and again, this goes to data quality, that set where we had sufficient information who had a baseline assessment and a reassessment and loan information. So with that set of organizations, we dove in deeper and we found the drivers behind finance, which ones received finance and which ones didn't, and what the drivers were of not the financial drivers, right? Not the turnover, etc., but the management maturity drivers. So we found that financial management, internal management, management capacity, governance, and marketing were all main drivers. And you can see on the slide the different elements below that that were crucial and where we saw a large correlation between those that got a loan and those that didn't. And the sizes of the circle you can see is the weighting on how that came together. So those things together are very much linked to the different dimensions of our scope methodology, which you can see on the left-hand side. But those things together led us to develop an access to finance score. And so with that access to finance score, we can now identify, or at least, the scope scores also go from 1 to 5. So the access to finance score also goes to 5. But with that, the higher the score, the more finance ready these organizations are. So we did that for all these organizations that on which we had sufficient data. And to highlight where this access to finance theory is linked to our methodology, Philippe, you can click and then you can see those 5 dimensions of our tool that really are correlated to that. Okay, so now the access to finance score, we did that for all these organizations, and that we could do for a larger sample size. So we did that for 1,683. And we found that only 6% of that, those 1,600 plus organizations score between 4 and 5. And that is a very low percentage. So if you take the ones that score 3 to 4 together, then you come to the 27% who have a relatively high access to finance score. So those might be the ones that if you would do this in a program, you could identify those and see, okay, maybe they are the first ones to be finance ready. So working with those, providing them the support they need can be that low-hanging fruit in your programs. But there's a lot of work to be done. I think that's what this shows, that there are a lot that still are not bankable. So if I may it so Dutch and bluntly, that a lot of BDS programs apparently do not deliver bankable organizations. Next slide. What we found is that the ones that did score high, so to 4 to 5, were able to access those larger loans. You can see that in the top graph. There, the average loan size is over $500,000. And if you go below the access to finance score of 4, you immediately drop down quite a bit. And of course, if you drop down to such low numbers, you need to have more loans to compensate. So here you see the big correlation between loan sizes, the access to finance score, and the ones that get larger loans, of course, don't need as many loans. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here it is indicated in the green part. Yeah, thanks. Another one, I think, and this is, I put this one in to highlight that this really speaks to the risk from the lender point of view. Because, and the top graph is the same as the one you saw on the previous page, but the 61 that scored higher are, if you look at the graph on the lower, below that, you can see that it's a little bit hard to see the legend, but you can see that the light blue and the green part are the parts that where the loan repayment status is either already paid or in the process of being paid. So the larger that light blue and green part is, the larger the chances for the lender to get their money back. So there also you see that correlation, that the scores, if you score between 4 and 5, that chance of not getting your money back is a lot lower than if you score a 1 or a 2. So But what does capacity building do? So here we looked at baseline and reassessment. So at the baseline, of course, they're not ready yet. You start with the program or the project, and there you can see on the left-hand side in that graph, the light blue charts, right? So the light blue ones, that's a baseline. There are lots and lots, over 40, 50, 60%. A lot of them, there's only 17% that really score relatively high. But after capacity building, you can see that the total access to finance score shifts. So you see that shift of that graph to the right-hand side. So you can see that more become finance ready, and the chances of getting a loan really increase to 36%. So this, I think, shows that overall, in general, if we average it all out, capacity building does help. Maybe you can click, Felipe? Because here you can see that shift, and this can, I think, be used to, how can we provide those data insights and those details of the access to finance score to maybe improve and make that capacity building even more focused if access to finance is the goal of the program. So there we can really zoom in on what is required to make that shift happen. Next slide, please. If we dive in, you remember that formula I showed you with those 5 elements. If we dive in deeper into these 5 elements, do they all show that same picture? And here we see that not all of them, maybe Felipe, you can click because then we can see the arches. Not all of them make that same shift. So the question is, and I don't have the answers, right? Because what we often are lacking is what kind of capacity building was provided. But if we would know what the focus was of the capacity building, we could see if that correlates with, for example, internal management. If a lot of focus was given there and you see this shift, then you say, okay, this was a very, very effective program, and you see, and you can measure the effect of the capacity building that was provided. But if you look at management capacity, for instance, that shift is not really there. I mean, maybe the lowest ones moved a little bit, but it is still not sufficient for these organizations to get financed. So then the question is, should then in the capacity building be more focus provided on that management, strengthening that management capacity? So this is really, where we see some shifts and some don't. So it would be great to, together with partners, see how we can, if we would use this data to inform capacity building, especially if access to finance is the goal of the project. If we would use that data to then, meet the goals of that and try to get them all finance ready, can we do that in a more effective way? Can we get more results? And by focusing on the needs of these organizations and maybe clustering them on those things that they share as weaknesses, by focusing on that and doing it on a needs basis, maybe smaller groups, and this is where, Hayden, you come in with a service delivery, right? So do you do it in groups or do it individually? What's the best way, most efficient way, but still to get the results and the impacts that we can jointly make. So we are very eager, and I think that's the, maybe one more click, and then you can see where we don't really see that move and shift. And then to the last slides, as an invite, in who wants to help, pilot this model and see if that data and those insights really actually lead to, and then we'll contact Hayden on how to measure that, increase that effectiveness. And I think our data can also show effectiveness, because there you can see if they got loans, if they did get more employment, if they increase their revenue, those things we all have. We have a lot more data than that even. But then on the cost side, that is one of the things that, yeah, more alignment and data sharing would be very helpful. Let me stop there.
Thank you for this interesting presentation, Marie. It's full of data. It's very, very good to see those.
That's what we do, Philippe.
Yeah, that's always very interesting for me. So we have one question so far on the chat, a clarification question. Do you define bankable as being ready or able to receive loans from commercial banks?
Yes, I think that, thank you for that question. We are, I think that the definition of bankable is missing, right? And it also depends very much on the type of lender you're speaking with, because I think SACCOs, MFIs, and commercial banks, they have each their own criteria. But what is necessary to have in order to connect the dots in this system is how to measure this for each and every one of those lenders. So which metrics do we use to identify eligibility? And this is what we will be working on in the next months, together with Oiko Credit and FarmPit Fund and other financial institutions. To the lenders should actually use certain criteria to say, okay, this is what I need. And others will say, this is what we need, because the different lenders will have different criteria. But we need to use the same metrics to express those requirements.
Great,
so that's
thanks.
what I mean by bankable or finance ready or eligible, or yeah, those are all the terms that we use.
Great, thanks. Since we don't have any more clarification questions, I propose we move into the next session, which is now interactive. So thank you everyone who stayed with us. So now we're going to have a discussion. And initially we thought of having 2 breakout groups because we had 60 registrations. But given the number, I would like to ask perhaps the panelists, what do you prefer? Do you think 24 people are manageable to have 23 people now, to have one discussion, or do we still want to have 2 breakout groups?
Philippe, I'm fine with doing one. Only may I then invite everyone on the call to be very proactive.
Right.
Because otherwise it doesn't make sense at all. And that's why we usually go to smaller groups, because then people don't keep silent. But I think if we can ask everyone to be participative, then that would be great. Sure,
we can also, I think, let's do the 2 breakout groups then, and we encourage more participation like this. So the idea will be to have 2 breakout groups. We're gonna use more or less 15 minutes to each. And after each discussion, we will have 5 minutes reporting back in plenary. The first 2 groups will discuss effectiveness of BDS for access to finance. Then we're going to come back in plenary, discuss what we heard from each other, and then go back into another breakout group for discussing scalability of BDS for access to finance. So now I'm going to stop the recording very quick because we're going to go into smaller groups. And then I'm going to set up the groups. And maybe we can start with a quick plenary feedback from what each group heard. Elena, I think you were reporting back from your group, right? Do you want to go first?
Sure, I can do that. And just to put out a disclaimer, I of course had some internet issues. So if I missed anything, my fellow breakout group mates can correct me or can add. We started with some key questions around, really how to make BDS effective for helping access to finance. One was around how can SMEs and FOs be segmented, because the starting point really matters for building their professionalism. And we agreed that the types of services that these enterprises receive will vary between whether they're in an early or late stage growth. And AgriGrade was mentioned as an example of how the segmentation can be done, because there's, it assumed that it segments enterprises into 4 levels of maturity, assuming that the lowest level are those enterprises that are really not ready for investment at this point, but building on that and trying to gather the data that helps us understand what their needs are in order to do that. But we also said that it's very important for all of us to collaborate, to speak to each other about what we're seeing, what we're learning in terms of developing those effective models. From an ISF perspective, even though knowing the growth profile of the enterprises in detail is helpful in practice, kind of a more basic understanding can be quite effective, because the different kinds of enterprises, whether they're agri-SMEs or cooperatives or other models, can actually be a good way to understand where that starting point is. So, we come back to the point that segmentation is critical for helping us understand how to start supporting enterprises. And then another question around helping FOs and SMEs to understand whether they're investable and whether they're ready to approach funders, and having some kind of system without needing to go through the full due diligence of commercial financial institutions, but having something a bit more accessible. And then we started to discuss a little bit about scope insights approach that Marisa presented about, essentially addressing not the lowest level or the lowest scoring enterprises, but the kind of one level up from there where a lot of the small loans are going, exactly, which at this point we're saying is being addressed by SACOs and MFIs and such, but really, again, understanding what can be done more in terms of getting local capital for them, more innovative financing models. Again, agri-grade approach in Uganda came up as an example of this, in which FIs are actually part of the segmentation process. But piloting that and really helping to understand what's necessary to take those to the next level is something that requires more collaboration. And then we got cut off as we were discussing the IWECO model for embedded services for smallholder farmers.
As it
Do we
normally
have
goes
time?
in breakout groups. Yes, if you want to continue discussing this afterwards, so you can definitely pick it up from where you stopped. I will actually propose that we do it in one group now, because we are only 18 participants. So to avoid losing time, like making breakout groups, I think we can do it in plenary. But before, let's just report back briefly on what our group discussed, because we also found some resonance on some echoes on the two presentations. And I would ask now, Mark, if you quickly can just brief us on what we discussed.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, ours was relatively quiet, wasn't it, as a group? So compared to your group. So I think the main sort of input and examples were provided from sort of Leah from Root Capital, and it was all about talking about the difficulty in showing BDS effectiveness when you've got multiple services coming in to one enterprise, and that they'd need time to develop the data sets over years to really make it useful to generate the learning and figure out what really is effective. So I think as long as you feel that you're generating the right data and you're generating it over a period of time, I think you're probably on the right track by the sounds of it. But if you're not generating that data and you're jumping from one project to the other and not able to track stuff over time, I think that's going to be where the challenge is. And I would like to see in the future that, that donors and governments and anybody who's financing these projects in the future are demanding more in that way. And then the other interesting thing from Leah was really talking just very, very briefly about segmentation, and so look how to look at effectiveness in terms of different segments, early and mature. And obviously in the ISF study there's discussion around sort of definitions for early and mature. They still need fine-tuning, they still need debates. It's flagged up in the ISF report for more investigation, and I think that's where AMEA would like to go as well, and obviously things like agri-grade are going in that direction as well, trying to sort of segment the market. So some good inputs. Look forward to more.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, we have now around more 15 minutes for the second discussion, and then we can quickly debrief in the end and discuss the conclusions and next steps. So I would just say we stay here as in plenary, but we discuss now the scalability of BDS for access to finance. So the second topic there you can see on the screen, and to help us think about how this discussion, we have some questions. So what are the BDS cost drivers? How can BDS be scaled up? And how do we change BDS delivery programs based on segmentations lessons? So what we have been hearing so far, right, in the two presentations. So I'll open the floor, but perhaps as Helena was suggesting, we could also just pick it up from where we stopped in the other group's discussion. So I'll let that group perhaps lead the discussions, perhaps Maurice or Hayden or Helena, if you want. Unmute yourself and just lead us on this.
I'll throw a question out here. I mean, I think from the ISF perspective and from the research that we did here, we're very interested by the cost and the cost efficiency of BDS provision. And I think it's an area where broadly across the market, there's probably more room and opportunity to kind of more deeply consider the drivers of cost of BDS provision, as well as the kind of measurement and assessment and honestly just thinking about it. And I think that is more for kind of a broader funder / donor perspective as well, of really truly more deeply considering the costs associated with BDS and what's actually driving that. But I think from a provider perspective, it is really interesting to think about what are some of those key kind of drivers. How can those be, in some sense, thought of in a deeper manner to understand how can we kind of scale BDS in the most efficient manner possible, where we're achieving similar impacts, but for reduced costs or greater impact for similar costs, right? So I would just kind of put an open question out to everyone, right? Does that kind of what I'm saying and what we've seen in our research, does that resonate with you? And then linking that back to kind of the broader access to finance point, would be interested to kind of hear maybe some of the nuance that kind of an access to finance goal and the cost drivers associated with that relative to maybe some other goals of BDS. So that's kind of a broad strokes question, something that we thought a lot about, but would love to hear others and input on there.
Maybe Hayden, I can add to add some questions to that. I think we're the asking parties here. No, because I think the cost drivers, I find it very interesting what came out of your study, because for the aggregate approach we have on that segmentation that we have designed, is that the level 1, 2 should be local BDS providers. So not international ones, that should be local. And it very much also sort of links into what USAID is doing. So the localization discussion, the general localization discussion, I think is an important one. And I hope it will be one of the drivers behind lowering the cost for BDS in the different programs. So I hope that's one, and I'm really eager to hear what others are saying about that. So that's one, I think one thing, and I forgot the other one. So I'll open the floor.
Well, let me just jump right in here and probably try to finish the conversation I started out in our group. My apologies for the background noise. I'm outdoors, so please do forgive me. Yes, we run a BDS service, like I would say something similar to what Maurice mentioned now, at the very local level. We blend aggregation and support services. So this way, we're able to collect, and this also speaks to data sets being collected over a period of time. We collect produce, we collect information about transactions of the farmer and the buyer. We also, over a period of time, collect the challenges that the value chain actors, not just the buyers and the farmers, because we have logistics in between that we have to put into consideration, what their challenges are. And we have kind of like over a period of time changed our business model several times to be able to adapt to the current challenges that we see. Right now, as I speak, we are working on a digital transformation project internally funded by the organization, where we are trying to have a digital supply chain. This way, we'll be able to collect even more data and document all of this process as compared to the manual way that we are doing this. And this is happening at the very micro level, what I can call level 1, or maybe between level 1 and level 2, so to say. And it has given us a greater insight into where we need to plug in funds for the farmers when it comes, funds for the logistics when it comes, funds even for the buyers when it comes as well. And then these are the things that we are trying to push out. But of course, to mention on the cost implications, it's huge for an organization, a small organization myself, to begin to put all of these things together. I'm able to leverage on the ICT skills that I have over a period of time to be able to do this. Not so many BDS has this skill set. It costs money. It does. So this is sometimes where the cost goes into building such systems. Again, when we relate with the value chain actors, there's a lot of cost that we incur in getting to the field, a lot of cost that we incur in setting up meetings, doing leg runs. This chops off a chunk of the revenue that we get from commissions, very minimal commissions that we get from providing these services. Because again, we understand the farmers cannot pay for the services upfront. So we've had to take that burden on ourselves, which is not making us move as fast as we should actually be able to do. So I would say embedded services and picking pinpoints that are local. In some other clusters, this may not be the problem that they are having. So cost also into human resources. It's been difficult, extremely difficult for us to be able to have a team that constantly does the M&E, because we are picking funds from the very minimal commissions that we get. So it's that essentially has been a journey, and I think this may be able to give you insights into solutions that may come in as you're building or making your research. Thank you.
Thank you for these contributions. There's one question on the chat, I think, but
Yeah, that was as Walid was or Sahid, sorry. Sahid. I spelled your name.
It's okay. Yes.
My apologies.
Okay.
Well, as you were speaking, it sounded indeed very hands-on and elaborate, and probably having all the impact. So I was just trying to see if we could match it with that number that presented on what's the average cost per organization or per group, or do you know that?
Well, not a breakdown per unit per se, but what we just did is for the commission, the revenue that we receive, we get between 25 to 30%, which also includes, by the way, the cost of logistics. And from that, I think we've been able to pin down about 5% for BDS service. About 5%, of course it varies, but for 5% allocated to take care of BDS service. But it's really not sustainable because of the volume of transactions that we are currently engaged in. But that's what we just penciled down.
Does anyone else have something to add on the cost drivers of BDS, or maybe how BDS can be made more efficient? For example, I don't know, the ones that know the scope scores, we also provide heat maps of scope scores per dimension, because we always believe that it's more effective to cluster organizations that have the same kind of weaknesses. And yeah, maybe I shouldn't ask here, but ask to all our clients. But does that help? Is that how it works? Or is it that still a lot of train all the organizations on everything because it's just more efficient that way? Hayden, is that something you came across with all your 15 cases?
It is. I saw Renee potentially unmute yourself there. So I'll before I hop in, I do have some thoughts, but if Renee, you have a comment there.
No, just go ahead. I go afterwards.
Great. Well, I was going to say it's one of our key kind of findings when it comes to cost was there's kind of one of the fundamental drivers, which it's very intuitive, right, is the actual service delivery model that is used to provide BDS. And we kind of simplified it into group-based SDMs, individual-based SDMs, and then a blended approach of kind of blended between the two. And so acknowledging that, again, as with most of what we did in this research, we kind of some of the nuance may be lost in some ways because we are bucketing and trying to compare, across different contexts. But we found that group-based SDMs actually were significantly cheaper than individual-based SDMs, which again, that does make intuitive sense. We heard a lot of kind of direct feedback from providers where that mitigates for some of the key cost drivers. So thinking about some of the kind of logistical cost drivers associated with BDS provision, physical travel to clients, especially with rising energy prices, right? It's everything kind of adds up. The time spent with individual clients over a given, let's say, a week, you can kind of make that more efficient with group-based models. What I think was really interesting and which there is actually a lot of kind of good, solid academic evidence out there of different contexts. And then we saw it as well in our own research and data was the effectiveness and the overall kind of efficiency outcomes for group-based SDMs were similar, if not better, in a lot of outcomes than individual-based, and not in all, right? But in many, and especially in situations where it's not the most common form of providing BDS. So there's a lot of feedback around, especially thinking about kind of later stage companies, more well-developed, more mature companies, larger companies who, and this is both a supply side and demand side problem, I would say, but so a lot of those times companies who fit that mold will actively seek out kind of individual support rather than group-based support. And BDS providers and donors as well, when designing programs, will kind of, if they're trying to target that segment, will often try to say, well, okay, companies like that don't need group-based support. It's more valuable to go individual. When in reality, there's actually a lot of really kind of positive benefits of a group-based SDM that late stage companies can gain. And we see that across industries and across markets, where think of things like successful kind of Fortune 500 CEOs learning from one another in kind of a group-based setting. And I think part of the issue here is almost a language and a framing issue, right? We hear group-based service delivery and we think people sitting in a classroom and kind of learning the same curriculum. That's not the case, right? It could be, but there's so much more kind of detail and nuance to a service delivery model that emphasizes things like peer-to-peer learning, right? Where, okay, it's not just kind of a consultant coming in and giving you kind of here's the curriculum and here's what should happen. You're actually learning from peers who maybe have been very successful in one facet of a business that another business has not been, and you can learn from that. So that's not just efficient, right? That's not a mitigating cost. That's also more effective in some ways. And so I think there's a real opportunity to kind of reframe that across the market from a donor perspective, from a provider perspective, and ultimately down to an SME perspective of understanding this isn't just a inherently kind of we're just doing this to cut cost thing. No, there's actually real kind of impact that can be made from this.
Thank you, Hayden. Marisa, see you unmuted. I don't know if you want to add anything.
It's very insightful. Thanks.
No, indeed, yeah. So, and we are running out of time. So I think just to conclude, I think one key aspect that I heard a lot about today is the importance of data. I think data is very, very present in all the presentations, but also in the discussions. So I think this could mean that for our continued learning agenda as part of the working group Access to Finance, we could think about dedicating one session for discussing access to finance being catalyzed by the use of data. So data for catalyzing access to finance is something we can discuss as a group later. But I think this was one of the key takeaways for me. That said, I would like then to thank you both panelists, Maurice and Hayden, for your presentations. Time flew by for sure. And I just would like to thank you for your time, and thank you everyone else as well for your time and contributions for this session. We'll share the recordings and the presentations summary later on. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and I saw one or two people wanting to unmute. So if there are questions, please reach out either to Felipe or to me. Happy to help out. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Felipe, for pulling us all together.
Yeah, thank